All right, so now that we've talked a little bit about how we analyze political violence, that is, what sort of lenses do we use to try to read this stuff, we need to talk about different forms of political violence. Now, today I am not going to be talking explicitly about terrorism. That is work for tomorrow, so that'll be super fun and, upbeat. But today I do want to talk about some other aspects of political violence because it turns out that not every type of violent political action is the same. So let's get into that. So the first thing that we have to do is that we have to come up with kind of a working definition here. So political violence can be used within the state itself to try and seek political goals. That is, let's say the state isn't responding to your needs or to your pressure. Remember David Easton and his systems theory? Like, you're giving the state input and the state is just not listening. So generally speaking, what's happening here is that political violence can be kind of a ramped up way of telling the state to do a thing or not do a thing. Like, hey, we really need you to do X, or hey, I need you to stop persecuting this group of people, or something like that. That is often where you see political violence expressed within a state. But we can also talk about like political violence as a broader change. Maybe that what you're trying to do isn't just trying to get your current government to respond to your current wants and needs, but maybe you're trying to bring down the system entirely. Maybe you're looking to end the current government, remember the people in power right now, or perhaps you're looking at something broader than that and you're looking for regime change. If you're looking for regime change, this is systemic. This is looking at like trying to end the regime, the current way of doing things, the operating system. Remember when we used our computer metaphor? The government is the program you have open right now. So if you're looking to like change the government, then you're going to bring up a different program. But if you are looking to like do regime change, you're going to tear out the guts of the computer and change the OS. You're going to change the operating system here, guys. Like that's going to take a little bit more. And then if you're looking to like bring down the state altogether, like Marx was ultimately, right? He was trying to seek the end of all states. Like, then you throw the computer away. So generally speaking, what you're looking at here is it's a question of scale. Like, how broad is the political change that you are seeking, and what is the scale and limit of that change? Sorry. Now, so this brings us to the concept of revolution, one of my very favorite. Like, for real, if I could teach any class in the world, I would teach political theory and history of revolutions. That's what I would do. So when you have demand for domestic systemic change, what you have can often lead to revolution. So revolution in and of itself, if we're just looking for a straightforward definition, O'Neill writes that revolution can be defined as the public seizure of the state in order to overturn the existing government and regime. Now, the critical word there is public seizure, or rather term. That's not a word. There are two. So public seizure, what it means is that the general population, or at least most people, either do or support the thing. They're trying to seize control of the state itself, not just part of it, and it's not just a small group of people. It is a large-scale action. So what we're looking at here when we're trying to determine, is this a revolution or is it something else? A revolution has public participation. That is critical. If you do not have the public, you do not have a revolution. Instead, you have a coup d'etat. If you only have a small segment of people who are trying to seize power, that's a coup d'etat. That is not a revolution. They are working to gain control of the state. That means they're not just trying to seize control of like Texas. They want everything, okay? So if the state of Texas decided to secede, which is illegal, and they decided to declare themselves once again the Republic of Texas, that would not be a revolution. That would be an illegal secession. But yeah, that's not the same thing. And generally speaking, revolutions fundamentally remake institutions. Remember, like radical and reactionary actions and attitudes? Here we're talking about the system doesn't work, burn it all down and build something new. So that is what we're talking about when we talk about revolutions. Not all revolutions are violence, although violence is very hard to avoid, because if you are fundamentally remaking institutions, remember, institutions are sticky, there's friction there. It's hard to move things that have been in place for a long time and that people see as foundational to their way of living. So it's going to take some effort, and that effort often involves violence. Now, it doesn't mean it has to. There have been political revolutions that have been largely nonviolent. I hesitate to say fully nonviolent because there's almost always some. I mean, we can look at, say, the Glorious Revolution in England after James the Second. Sorry, trying to remember my British history here for a moment. After James II, and the fears that he was going to be a fully Catholic monarch, and it led to his daughter Mary and her husband William being brought in as the new monarchs because they were nice and Protestant. So that was a broadly bloodless system, but it also wasn't particularly revolutionary. The biggest revolutionary thing about the Glorious Revolution was the role of Parliament expanded as a result of it. But it didn't, like, totally remake class systems or anything like that. Truly revolutionary action almost always has some degree of violence to it. So what causes revolution? Well, gosh, there are lots and lots of theories about this. Generally speaking, early political science tended to just not look systematically at causes of revolution and instead just describe them. It was almost like they were just natural forces. So if you look at, say, like early early writings about the French Revolution, it's like this thing happened to people, not like people made this thing happen. It really kind of takes away the agency of political actors and instead just kind of describes almost like the peasants and the revolution that occurred as a result of their political unhappiness as almost like this wave, this tsunami. It's really interesting reading, and it's kind of infuriating because it's very, very passive in terms of the way that it describes political events. But by the middle of the 1950s, like, that was just not cutting it anymore. The world was clearly full of political actors, and it wasn't just, white guys in power. It was lots of different types of political action. So what you see in the 1950s, largely as a result of the behavioral revolution in psychology, what you start to see is people really digging into individual motivations for revolution. And in particular, there comes this really interesting model for understanding political behavior that I think you all should know. And this idea is called the relative deprivation model. And relative deprivation theory basically states that revolution or extreme political action is what happens when there is a gap between the actual conditions that a person is experiencing and the expectations that they believe are due to them. So when a person has expectations of a certain standard of living or of a certain way of understanding the world, and then those expectations are significantly undermet, that is, like, it's not just they fall short by a little, but they fall short by a lot, the bigger that gap between the expectation and reality, the more likely it is that you are to see some sort of destabilizing political action, including violence. So what can happen is people can be desperately poor, but if you give people long enough, and unfortunately they become used to that poverty enough, that poverty in and of itself isn't enough to cause revolution. What causes revolution is when the existing state of affairs is not met in some regards. So people can put up with a lot. They can put up with a whole bunch of systemic inequality, with racism, with gender inequalities, with all sorts of stuff, with misogyny. But when all of a sudden the bottom falls out and the system, the kind of the base on which people had been resting, however precarious it was, collapses, that collapse, that slip from expectation to reality, is often the trigger point that causes violent action. So relative deprivation model is really developed in the 1960s and 70s, and it's still in widespread use and has a lot of validity to it. There's a lot of really interesting sort of scholarship about relative deprivation theory. Now, the broader analysis of structuralist causes to revolution using an institutional model of political violence analyses is something that really came about in the 1980s, particularly with like British Marxists, but we don't need to get into that. Um, sorry. So institutional analysis is really kind of a more modern way of looking at things. But remember, there's not just one correct way to look at political action. Instead, we should always look at political action and political violence through multiple lenses. Think of it as kind of like, when you get your eyes examined and the doctor is like, which one's clearer, one or two, one or two. Flip back and forth between those lenses. See which one brings things into focus a little bit more. It is correct and right for you to do that. And sometimes multiple lenses need to be layered in order for us to get a full picture of what's going on. So there you go. That is kind of our introduction to different forms of political violence. Tomorrow, we are going to dive right into terrorism. So that'll be great. See you then. Bye.